try and be brave and cut back the chemical fertilizer that you're spreading on it to get the benefit from it. And that's really what it's all about, is reducing the level of chemical fertilizer and overall increasing performance and profitability of the system.
Hello and welcome to this joint episode of the Beef Edge and OviCast podcast. I'm Ciaran Egan, host of the Teagasc Beef podcast.
And I'm Ciaran Lynch, host of OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. In this week's episode, we bring you a joint episode on all things clover, and we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Mike Egan, Teagasc researcher, to discuss tips and advice on incorporating white clover into your dry stock system.
Mike, you're very welcome. With the price of chemical fertiliser this spring, is clover an option on dry stock farms?
Yeah, I think even regardless of the price of fertiliser, I think clover is definitely an option on all grass-based systems, dairy, beef and sheep. And I suppose that's really been driven by the environmental concerns that are there at the moment, and as you said, the rising cost of fertiliser. We can get huge, significant reductions in chemical fertiliser by 100 to 150 kilos of chemical nitrogen per hectare, and that's coming from clover's ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available in the soil to the plant. So that's both on the chemical side, or the chemical nitrogen reduction side, and then we have the environmental emissions gains with that as well. But I suppose the third point then is the benefit that we can get from the animal. White clover is a very nutritious plant. It has a higher crude protein, lower fibre, and as a result we can get greater increases in animal dry matter intake, which can lead to an overall increase in animal performance by in the region of 10 to 15% increase in animal performance from having clover in the sward. So it's definitely an option for all grassland farmers and particularly dry stock farmers as well.
How does clover actually work, Mike?
Yeah, so clover is the part of the legume family, and there's a couple of different legumes there, but I suppose white clover is probably the one that's most suited to our systems. So in terms of its nitrogen fixing ability, white clover is a unique plant in terms of its growth structure. So it has generally what we all see in the sward is above the ground. It has 3 leaves and a white flower, and that's what the animals graze. And in terms of that part of the plant, because it has nitrogen fixing ability, it has a higher nitrogen content or higher crude protein content in the sward. And because it has no stem per se in the plant, it has a lower fibre content in the sward as well. So that's what's giving us the animal production benefit, that above ground stuff that we all see. But typically what we don't see is what's happening below the ground. And at the base of those white clover plants and the petioles that we see above the ground, we have what's called a stolon. And those stolons run along the surface of the ground or just below the surface of the ground. And on those, we have small little root structures. And in those root structures, then we have what's called root nodules. And that root nodules is where all of the nitrogen fixation ability occurs. So the white clover has an ability to take nitrogen from the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is made up of greater than 70% nitrogen. So the clover has an ability to take that nitrogen in through the leaf from the surface, bring it down through the petiole into the stolon and down into the root nodule. And in that root nodule, we have what's called rhizobia bacteria that the plant gets from the soil. And that rhizobia bacteria effectively infects the root nodules. And that's the bacteria that converts that atmospheric nitrogen into a plant usable source, and that's stored then in the root nodules of the base of the plant. And then as the root nodules die and decay, which happens across the year, that nitrogen that's stored in those root nodules is then released into the soil that can be used then by the clover and the companion species to grow grass, and that allows us to reduce the chemical fertilizer.
Mike, there's huge benefits having clover in the sward, and I suppose one of the challenges on dry stock farms is typically we see very low clover content in swards, and really in most cases it probably only goes in with reseeds.
Yeah, so it is, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we see out there. And there's a lot of talk about clover at the moment, but one of the big challenges we do have is getting it on farm. And if we look historically, the last 3 years there's been a huge renewed interest in it. But historically, 80% of all grass seed mixes sold all off the shelf had clover included in the seed mixture. So if nothing else, if we're seeding on average between 6 and 8% of the national farm has been, or national grassland has been reseeded every year, we should see a significant increase in the amount of clover that's been established in these farms because clover included in all the seed mixes. But that's not the case. So there's something happening around the establishment point that's not actually portraying into actually high clover content in the swards. And I suppose that's down to probably a couple of key things, and particularly in a reseeded sward, the post-sowing management in terms of the weed control, the grazing management, and the soil fertility of those paddocks that's sown is probably three things that we need to delve into and probably pay closer attention to in terms of what's happening around the establishment point in that. And then you have your over-sowing management as well, and we'll go through that in a minute. But I suppose what we need, clover is a very sensitive plant. So in terms of getting a good establishment, regardless of what method you're using, because of its very shallow root structure, and because it has its nitrogen fixation ability, it's a very energy hungry plant. And if we don't have the correct soil fertility at time of establishment, at time of sowing, sorry, we won't get a strong enough plant establishment to persist into the sward to allow that go forward. And when I talk about soil fertility, I'm talking about optimum soil pH, so minimum 6.3 and ideally 6.5. So again, that soil pH is essential for that rhizobia bacteria that infect the root nodules that actually allow for the nitrogen fixation ability. And then minimum index 3 and ideally index 4 for P's and K's. So again, P is essential for taproot development, which happens in the first 6 months of the plant's life. And then K is essential for long-term stolon production going across the year, and that's what actually gives rise to the persistence of the plant. So if we don't have the optimum soil fertility at time of sowing, we're really up against an uphill battle from day one, Ciaran.
If we look at the option of trying to incorporate it into existing swards, which is probably where a lot of this effort needs to be put in, field selection, Mike, obviously is going to have a big impact on. So soil fertility is one. You touched on weeds as well. Like, how big of an issue would that be for trying to get over-sown back in again?
Yeah, so like if we look at the two methods of establishment, reseeding and over-sowing. So if we just focus on over-sowing first of all, so effectively what that is you're establishing a new clover seed into an already established and actively growing grass sward. And that in itself is a challenge straight away. So, but if we don't have the optimum soil fertility, again, we're really up an uphill battle. So when you're looking at the option of over-sowing, and it is a very successful method of doing it if it's done right, but we need to get the paddock selection right. So number one is optimum soil fertility, and that's optimal soil fertility at time of sowing, not going to address it at the same time as you're sowing. So it has to be that 6.3 to 6.5 soil pH and index 3s and 4s for P and K at sowing time, not being correct at that time. That's the first one. Second one then is we're putting clover seed out into the sward, and for any seed, we need soil seed contact. So if you have a very, very dense sward, it is a lot more difficult to get that soil seed contact. So the more open swards, typically more recently reseeded swards, or low level of weed grass or kind of weed level in the sward, typically have your more open sward. So your more open swards are more suited to over-sowing because you get that soil seed contact, and then having a low level of weeds in the sward as well. So there's no point in going over-sowing clover into a sward that has a dock issue or a thistle issue or a nettle issue, whatever it is. That needs to be sorted first before we go looking at over-sowing. And just even with that, controlling weeds with non-clover safe sprays, there is what's called a residual effect. So non-clover safe sprays will kill the clover if there's clover in the plant. But the residual, or that active ingredient, the chemical active ingredient that will kill the clover, can stay active in the soil for up to, depending on the product, for between 2 and 6 months before you're actually that active has gone out of the soil. So if you have a weed problem, that weed problem needs to be sorted for between 2 and 6 months, depending on the product that you're using, before you go over sowing clover. So in terms of getting your paddock selection and soil fertility, open high ryegrass content swards and low level of weed content in the swards before you go looking at over-sowing, Ciaran.
So in some ways, Mike, we could be preparing a field for next year, this year.
Yes.
There is that preparation work needs to go into it first.
Yeah, you can't just go and say, right, I'm going to oversow this paddock in the morning. You need to have prep work. So look at if it has, and I'm not saying don't go and oversow a paddock in the morning. If the criteria in terms of optimum soil fertility, no weeds in the sward, and high ryegrass open swards. If you have a paddock that meets that criteria in the morning, fantastic, go and do it. But if you don't, put a plan in place now to try and get those paddocks ready for next year. So putting out lime, putting out your slurry and your P and K this year, or sorting any weed problem that may be there. So it does meet that kind of checklist for next spring.
Okay. Talk to me a little bit about timing in terms of best time to sow and kind of what rates we should be sowing at for going that
so
over-sowing.
in over-sowing, we have a very short window of over-sowing in terms of when we're doing it. And it varies slightly across the country, but you are talking the month of April, give or take, the last couple of weeks in March, or the first 2 weeks to 10 days in May. And the reason is soil moisture. So when we look at, and I'm in charge of the Clover 150 on-farm program, and we have it's majority made up of dairy farms, but there are a proportion of dairy or beef and sheep farms in it as well. But when we look at the over-sowing data coming from those, paddocks that are oversown in April up until the 25th of March to the 5th of May. So paddocks that are oversown in that window, we get the best clover establishment. Once we go into May and later on in May and into June, we get a much lower level of clover establishment in those paddocks by oversown. And the main reason for that is soil moisture. And that's why I'm saying it varies across the country. But if you're in a region that burns up very early in early June, that clover seed needs to be in the ground 6 weeks beforehand. Or if you have a paddock or farm that doesn't burn up at all, you can go slightly into later April or very early May. But again, you're talking about 6 weeks before you run into a moisture deficit, soil moisture deficit in terms of having that clover plant. And typically April is probably the safest month for doing that. And when we look at paddocks that are oversown in April versus paddocks that are oversown in May, there's a 6% difference in sward clover content coming from the commercial farms that we're working at the moment. So again, 6% higher clover content in paddocks sown in April versus May.
So it has a big impact. Look, Mike, in the past, some farmers have tried to sow clover, just broadcasting it out on paddocks or maybe mixing it with slurry to apply after a cut on paddocks. It had very limited success. You might just take us through why that was the case.
Yeah, so the biggest thing you need when you're oversowing is that seed, as well as the paddock selection that we touched on a while ago, but that seed needs to touch the soil. And typically in sheep grazing swards, they are a more dense nature. So if you go broadcasting seed with in very dense sheep swards or beef swards, that seed are not guaranteed soil seed contact. So by broadcasting it, it's a lot more variable in terms of that soil seed contact. And in terms of slurry application, I would tend to keep away from slurry application method. And I know it's convenient at times, but the problem is you're going out to 2,000 gallons a acre. You can't really control the amount of seed that's going out equally across that acre when you're spreading the 2,000 gallons of slurry. And the second point then is that you're not going to get soil seed contact, and if the slurry is anyway thick, it's going to coat the seed and smother it. So I would typically try and avoid applying clover with a slurry spreader mixed in through the slurry. And back to the broadcasting then. So if you don't get that soil seed contact, it's very variable. So there's a couple of different methods of oversowing. So you can broadcast it or you can stitch it in. And there's varying different types of machines that stitch it in. There's ironbox, there's guttlers, there's unidrills, and there's different versions of different machines. But there's tine harrow type ones, or ones that cut the slit, and then the guttler has the furrow press roller on the back of it. So typically, if with sheep swards, and some of the work coming out of Athenry with Philip Cretan would suggest that to get successful oversowing with sheep swards, you do need to go in with some sort of cultivation method, whether it be the tine harrow, Einbach rakeman type machine, or the guttler, unidrill, moor drill type machine, that you do get some level of soil disturbance, and you're going to get a ripping of the sward to try and open the sward up a little bit more versus just the broadcasting out. So you probably are better going with some sort of cultivation method in your denser sheep grazing swards.
It needs a bit of intervention. Just in terms of prep for that, and you covered the method today, but how tight should that be grazed beforehand? The kind of sward we're going into, that's going to have a bit of an impact on how successful that mechanical intervention is going to have as well.
Yeah, so obviously the biggest thing with oversowing is soil seed contact. And if you have a high residual or a high post-grazing sward height left in the paddock before you oversow it, the chance of getting that good soil seed contact are greatly reduced, even if using some of the cultivation methods, the guttlers or the ironbox or the rakemans. So realistically, you need a tight post-grazing sward height of 4 centimeters or less post-grazing sward height, and the tighter the better, because you're opening up the sward and you're reducing the regrowth of that sward, and you're allowing that light down to the base of the sward. So it needs soil seed contact and light to the base of the sward, and the only way to guarantee that is a low post-grazing sward height. And again, that's the best way to do it. So ideally after a surplus cut of bales, because it's very clean, or after a very tight grazing in April, go in straight away and do it. And in terms of seeding rates in oversowing, we're probably typically somewhere around between 2 and 3 kilos, closer to 3 kilos for sheep grazing swards, and closer to the 2.5 kilos for larger cattle grazing swards, just because their density of their nature. Whereas in a reseed, you're talking 1.5 kilos to 2 kilos.
More open sward suits. Just, Mike, in terms of varieties, what suits best for those systems, for grazing systems?
Yeah, so look, there's going to be an issue with varieties again this year, but in terms of varieties, you're looking at your small and your medium leaf cultivars. For your very intensive sheep grazing swards, you're probably erring towards the smaller end of the medium leaf cultivars, and whereas your beef grazing swards, you're probably looking at your medium leaf cultivars. So the likes of your smalls would be your Alice, Galway, and Coolfin, and then your medium leaf cultivars, you have Aberhurled, Chieftain, Crusader, Buddy, Iona, and there's a range of them there at the time as well. So again, you're looking at your medium and your small leaf cultivars. Your larger leaf cultivars are more suited for a silage grazing sward rather than an intensive grazing sward. So I would try and avoid your large ones, but keep at your mediums and your smalls.
Mike, really, establishment is only part of the process, and management of the clover sward is very important and sometimes overlooked. How should a grass clover sward be managed?
Yeah, and I suppose there's probably two things we need to look at when we're managing it. So the management of establishing swards and the management of established swards. So when we look at and we didn't really talk about reseeding with Ciaran, but the principles for reseeding with a grass clover sward or a grass owning sward are the exact same thing. It's only you're going with a clover safe herbicide, and make sure there's a clover safe herbicide on your fully reseeded clover swards. But the management of those swards, whether they be reseeded or oversown afterwards, is vital. So even if you get the paddock selection right and the soil seed contact and your methodology put out right and the right sowing rate, the most important element after that is light down to the base of the sward. Clover needs light for establishing and when it is established. And the only way we can do that is low post-grazing sward height and low pre-grazing covers. So in terms of pre-grazing covers for the following, in the establishment year, we want to avoid heavy cuts of silage or any cuts of silage in the first year of a reseeded or oversown sward. In terms of the final grazing later on in the year, we want to make sure it's grazed later on in the final rotation, so it has a low cover on it over the winter. And realistically, we want to be grazing it at somewhere between 800 to 1100 of a pre-grazing cover, or somewhere between 6 to 7 centimeters of a pre-grazing sward height on those swards for the first 6 to 8 months in the establishment phase. Once those swards are established then for the following year, they still need light down to the base of the sward. White clover doesn't really like silage cuts taken off it because it reduces the amount of light down to the base of the sward, and that's why your larger and your red leaf and red clover are more suited for silage mixes. So again, frequent tight grazing, so set stocking or continuous grazing of white clover swards doesn't really suit because, or for the grass component either, because it doesn't leave the plant a chance to rejuvenate its energy reserves that it gets from sunlight in the rest period. So ideally, you're talking about a post-grazing sward height of 4 centimeters, pre-grazing sward height of between 8 to 10 centimeters, a frequent grazing of somewhere around 20 to 22, 23, 24 days in the middle of the year, and avoiding heavy cuts of silage. So again, we don't want to let heavy covers build up on it. We don't want to let high residuals build up on it or taking heavy cuts of silage off it, because what that will do is will reduce the amount of stolons that we have at the base of the sward, and that stolons is where everything comes from, the nodules below the ground that fix the nitrogen, and then the herbage and the yield that gives us the animal production benefits there afterwards. And that's what allows us to reduce the chemical fertilizer on those swards.
Really, a good infrastructure and paddock system is essential then, Mike, when it comes to incorporating or reseeding.
Yeah, so really, when we look at clover, we are talking about a rotational grazing system on it. And if you don't have that infrastructure in place, paddock grazing, your growth in 3 weeks, graze it in 3 days type of scenario, it is going to be very difficult to establish it, number one, and maintain it in the sward long term as well. So good grazing infrastructure that you can put the animals in to graze it, and then to keep them off and give it that 3-week rest period. That 3-week rest period is vital to allow it build up its energy reserves in the plant, to allow it to build up its root nodules and the nitrogen fixation abilities of that as well. And continuous stocking doesn't allow that.
From a fertilizer point of view, Mike, what fertilizer should the clover grass sward get from May onwards once it's reseeded?
Yeah, so look, if you're reseeding swards this year, you still need some level of chemical fertilizer on it, because there is that little bit of a lag in terms of the nitrogen, the clover plant going through its distinct establishment phases. So I'm not saying to go with high levels of chemical fertilizer, but you do need some level of chemical fertilizer. And if you can go out with some sort of pea fertilizer, it does help in that establishment year. So if a paddock has been reseeded or oversown this spring, I would say you're going with half of what you would normally spread in that intervening period, and use some sort of compound fertilizer to allow that taproot development. But once you have an established clover sward, typically, and so all of the work would suggest growing high levels of dry matter in Athenry and in Grange and in Johnstown Castle. They're getting away with between 50 and 75 kilos of chemical nitrogen per hectare per year, and most of that is being front loaded. So all of that nitrogen has been applied in March, April, and May, and then from June onwards, there is little to zero chemical fertilizer going out on those swards that have adequate clover content. So kind of hitting that 20-25% sward clover content. That's when we see the big benefit in terms of nitrogen fixation. So you can apply that nitrogen early on in spring, and then you're going with very low to none rates of chemical fertilizer from mid-May onwards, because that's typically when we get the highest clover content and the highest nitrogen fixation ability during that period.
Mike, you just touched on something there, like that clover plant's ability to fix nitrogen in the first year is more limited. Just maybe take us through that and what happens in subsequent years with it.
Yeah, so the white clover and red clover, and we didn't really touch on red clover, but I'm not going to get into too much detail, but they're two legume plants, but they're vastly different plants. So if you look at red clover, and the reason it's so suited to a silage grazing sward is because it has one central taproot, and the plant goes up into the air, and all of that, it just develops its taproot, and the nodules are on that taproot from day one, or as soon as the plant starts to establish. And that's how it survives. It doesn't have any stolons, and that's why it doesn't persist under grazing, because the growing point is above the ground. White clover has to go through 3 distinct phases from establishment to being a fully fledged independent plant. So it goes through the rosette phase that can last anywhere between 2 to 3 months. And what that is, once the clover seed germinates, it has to develop a central taproot structure below the ground, and then it starts to put up leaves above the ground. And that's kind of 2 month to 3 month period. And during that period, it doesn't have any stolons, or it's just beginning to develop stolons later on during that rosette phase. After 2 to 3 months, it moves from the rosette phase to what's called the expansion phase. And this is when it starts to develop stolons. That is typically what you see in the base of this sward, and that gives its full-time establishment afterwards. So from month 2 or 3 onwards, it develops these network of stolons at the ground, coming from that central taproot. And after 8 months, that central taproot then dies. So whereas in the red clover plant, the central taproot stays alive as long as the plant is in the sward, whereas white clover, that central taproot only stays alive for between 8 to 10 months. Typically, it's gone after about 8 months, but somewhere between 8 to 10 months. And then that's when the stolons are fully developed. But during that month, from month 3 to month 8, during that expansion phase, when it's developing its stolons, that's when the root nodules begin to develop on the white clover plant. Whereas in the red clover plant, they're there from the first month to 6 weeks. So not that it doesn't fix nitrogen during that first year, it's just there is a lag in terms of when the nitrogen is released into the soil. Whereas in the red clover, it doesn't have to go through those 3 phases. It can release the nitrogen into the soil straight away. The white clover has that kind of lag phase of when the nitrogen is released into the soil. And that's why some level of chemical fertilizer is important for the grass component of the plant. Because the white clover uses the nitrogen itself, it's not releasing any of that nitrogen into the soil. Therefore, then it leaves the soil or the grass component at a disadvantage. So some level of chemical fertilizer during that year. But then from the second year and subsequent years on, what happens is the stolon network is there. The clover content is lowest in spring when temperatures are lower. It increases then from May. It has a peak in July, August, and then it falls off then in September into November again. And the nitrogen fixation ability of that plant follows that same trend. So there's lower levels of nitrogen fixation in the spring. That's why we front load our chemical fertilizer. When temperatures rise up then coming in May and clover content is beginning to increase, that's when we see a significant increased amount of nitrogen that's been fixed by the plant. And then later on then into the year, it starts to decline then from October onwards, and that's when the nitrogen fixation ability declines. So it's very similar to the grass growth curve, but probably only about 2 months later in terms of its nitrogen fixation. And that's why that nitrogen in spring is vital in terms of your grass clover swards.
Okay, so we just need to be realistic about its potential in that first season.
Yeah, and not to say that it doesn't fix nitrogen, it's the release into the soil that is the issue. And if to go with you can go at 0 level of chemical fertilizer in the first year, but what can happen is you can get a very high or dominant clover sward because the grass is struggling for nitrogen, because it doesn't release the nitrogen straight away. It uses itself and then it releases it. And the grass component of the plant can be nitrogen hungry and can struggle as a result of it. So you don't need very high levels of chemical fertilizer, but some level of chemical fertilizer early on in the establishment year.
Mike, a concern farmers might have is the risk of bloat. How could
Yeah.
that be avoided?
Yeah, so look at it, and it's probably back to the level of clover in the sward. So bloat can potentially be an issue, and probably more so on larger ruminants than on sheep grazing swards. It's still something you need to be vigilant for, but it's not as much of an issue on sheep as it would be on dairy or beef cattle. So what it is when animals are grazing the clover sward, it is because it has a higher crude protein and a lower fiber content, it digests or breaks down in the rumen faster than a grass component or silage would in the rumen. And as a result, then the buildup of gas is faster, and actually it is the buildup of gas is faster than what the animal is able to expel. And as a result, then it blocks up the whole system and can crush the animal from the inside. So it happens typically when you have high clover content paddocks, very low levels of dry matter, so aftergrass or on a damp, drizzly, wet morning, excessively hungry animals coming in to graze that sward when they're put into the paddock the first day, or not as much of an issue, but something that needs to be kept aware of as well is animals that are moving from, you've reseeded 2 paddocks, you have very good levels of clover, but the other 90% of your farm has no clover on it, so they're not used to grazing clover. And when you come into those clover paddocks after being on grass-only paddocks for the last 2 to 3 weeks, they can kind of gorge themselves on the clover and the rumen isn't adjusted to it. So they're probably the 4 key things that we need to keep aware of. Once we're aware of those high risks, so high levels of clover content, I would say anything above 40%, aftergrass, low dry matter grass, low pre-grazing covers, damp, drizzly, wet mornings, and excessively hungry animals and not being used to grazing clover. So once we're aware of those, we can kind of prevent it as much as possible. So there's 2 ways of preventing it. Number 1, bloat oil in the water. Or the second thing is if you're putting your animals into a 3-day paddock, even if there's only 40 or 50% clover in the sward, the animals in the first 2 to 3 hours, they can actually go and select 80% clover in their diet or more, because they can go and select the clover of the paddock. So in the first grazing, rather than leaving them into the entire paddock, the entire 2 or 3 day paddock, putting up a small, what we call is a breakfast break. So when you're putting them in, you put up a small strip wire. The first time, it just removes that large gorging process on the clover, and then you let them onto the paddock. Now, you don't need to do that every time. It's only if you have that 4 risk period, high clover content, excessively hungry animals, or low pre-grazing covers coming into it. So it's just being aware of those risk periods and putting something in place to prevent it rather than having an issue.
Mike, you've covered a huge range of detail in that, but for farmers out there, where can they get access to more information on it as a resource?
Yeah, so if there is a Teagasc, like the reseeding manual, but there's a Teagasc white clover booklet that's available on the Teagasc website. There is also a series of videos and podcasts, and there's also information on Pasture Base Ireland. And then there's the Teagasc scorecard for assessing sward clover content in the paddocks as well. And look, I know I probably went through an awful lot of information there, but I think for anyone that has no clover or only looking at putting it in now, try 1 or 2 paddocks. Focus on those. Don't do large areas of farm at a time. Do small proportions that you can get it established well on it. You can get those paddocks up and running, manage them correctly, and then increase it the following years. If you're looking at over-sowing, make sure you have that criteria in place. And if no paddocks meet that criteria this year, that's fine. Get them in line for next year. And where there is good levels of clover in the sward, try and be brave and cut back the chemical fertilizer that you're spreading on it to get the benefit from it. And that's really what it's all about, is reducing the level of chemical fertilizer and overall increasing performance and profitability of the system.
Thanks to that, Mike. We'll include that link in the show notes. Okay, that's all for this week's episode. Our thanks to Michael for joining us on the show. You can catch up with all other shows and interviews on the Beef Edge podcast and the OviCast podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple, Google Podcasts, as well as on Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and follow us so you never miss a show.
For all other updates from our beef and sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Ciaran Egan.
And I'm Ciaran Lynch. Thanks for listening.